The pandemic has led to the cancellation of campaign rallies, which during any other election year would be in full tilt right now. Much like those of us quarantining at home, the Trump campaign is trying to adapt to the new normal. According to the New York Times, the president's 2020 campaign manager, Brad Parscale, remains unfazed by falling poll numbers, raising the question, quote, can the Trump campaign rewrite the story of the Trump presidency? Robert Draper joins me now. He is the author of that article and spoke directly with Brad Parscale. Robert, thanks very much for being with us.
Sure, my pleasure.
So a major draw of the Trump campaign was, of course, the rallies that he held. Parscale has called them giant focus groups. Then, as the toll of the coronavirus became more clear, we saw President Trump during those coronavirus task force briefings. And we just saw today the president in Arizona. How is Brad Parscale's strategy adapting in this era?
Well, fortunately, Parscale, in the previous election cycle, was candidate Trump's director of digital operations. So he knows how to run a digital campaign as well as anybody could under these rather trying circumstances. That being said, I mean, even though they have a digital communication strategy, even though they have been able to communicate to volunteers, to raise more money online, the campaign rally was central to Trump's identity, and I mean, to the Trump campaign's identity, but really maybe the most symbolic feature of his presidency, with these vast crowds and him working the media and all the theatrics that were involved in it are now gone. And the closest substitute for it are the press briefings that he's been holding relating to the coronavirus. But obviously, there are limitations on what he can say during those things. And so Parscale has adapted only because he has to, and has been running the operation outside or from his home office in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. But again, I mean, at least he is fully staffed up and has a very, very capable digital operation. So under these rather unusual circumstances, he's doing the best that can be done.
Well, you talk about January and February as two crucial months for President Trump. Can you explain how his campaign changed during that time?
Sure. By late January, of course, they were waiting on an opponent, but they had tons of money in the bank, tons of cash on hand. They had really so much money that while the person that they figured that they would be facing, the person who indeed they will be facing, Joe Biden, had only like say 7 million or so between the RNC and the Trump campaign operation itself. They had literally like 100 million or so, which would allow them not only to play to the base as they have been doing, but also to reach out to constituent groups such as Latinos, such as African Americans, who have not viewed this president very favorably. So that's the situation as it was then. And of course, back in late January, the economy was doing great. Trump's favorability was higher than it had ever been. He had reached, I think, 49 in Gallup, and they were able also to consider the possibility of playing in states like Minnesota and New Mexico that would have been unthinkable, say, in 2016. All of that was before the coronavirus hit. And all of that then began to change throughout the month of February and finally into March, when I think on March the 2nd, he had his last campaign rally, Trump did. And they had planned to do more on in mid-March, but on March 13th announced that they would be closing those, and the Arlington-based campaign headquarters of Trump has been shuttered ever since.
Well, taking a step back, you write that Brad Parscale was promoted to campaign digital director in 2016 after arguing that, quote, people buy stories, not things. What did he mean by that, and why does that work for the Trump campaign?
Sure, you have to consider about Parscale that he is an ad man at heart. He is a web designer, but really with a kind of entrepreneurial Madison Avenue bent to him. And what he was saying to then campaign chairman Paul Manafort in the summer of 2016, when he was being promoted to director of digital operations from a guy who's basically just managing web traffic, was that he used the original ad campaign of the iPod, and there was one. There had been 200 under consideration, according to Parscale. One of the device itself, another of a silhouette of a woman dancing frenetically. Parscale said that that latter ad campaign pitch won out because people buy stories, not things. It is the motion, the dance that matters. How he applies this basically to the Trump campaign is that things, to put it charitably, need not be fact based. That as long as you run a good narrative, whether it is Make America Great Again or the Great American Comeback, which is now what they're sort of aiming for, people will buy into a story. The problem with this now is that with the pandemic in full force, the election threatens to become a referendum on the president rather than a choice between the president and his campaign. This is a very traditional, duality that takes place in presidential campaigns. But it's one now where all eyes are on the president, both for the better and for the worse. And Biden is far less consequential, and I think wisely has kind of stayed in the background to allow the Klieg lights to be on this president as he tries his best to manage a pandemic situation.
Right, because for the first time, some might argue, you have a set of facts which is impossible really for anyone to question. When you talk about the number of confirmed cases and the death toll, it becomes a much more difficult thing to discuss and sort of navigate in any kind of way that might be other than sort of taking on responsibility or ownership of what has taken place in the country. So, like other presidents, Robert, President Trump has really prioritized trust in his inner circle. You wrote about this, and that includes appointing members of his family to senior advisor positions. What is it, Robert, about Brad Parscale that appeals to both the president and his family, and how has he demonstrated his loyalty?
Well, simply put, he has demonstrated his loyalty going back to 2011 when he began to design webs for commercial real estate for the Trump operation, and then for Melania skincare products, for the Trump winery, for a variety of other things, for charitable causes relating to things that Eric Trump was doing. So systematically, he won over various people in the Trump family who were notoriously suspicious of people, thinking that they keep a very, very close circle. But Parscale charged fairly, did his work competently, turned the work in punctually. And so when it came time then to design a website for candidate Trump's exploratory committee in early 2015, he was the natural choice. But it also came to be the case that as other campaign managers fell away, Corey Lewandowski and then Paul Manafort, Parscale was the one who'd been close to the family, and so when Lewandowski, was falling from grace, everyone in the family was pointing fingers at him. Where Parscale very much commands the affection of all these important people. Eric Trump is really one of the senior most people in the campaign. Jared Kushner, of course, is the son-in-law and the shadow CEO of the campaign, and Parscale has essentially been Kushner's right-hand man. So, if anything, I think his weakest link has been with Trump himself, because Trump doesn't know him nearly as well as the others do, and I think Trump sees a little bit of himself in Parscale, a bit of the hustler, a guy who likes making money, and I think for Trump, the jury has always been out as to whether or not Parscale, despite his showing loyalty to whatever extent a person can, that Parscale's really in it to make a fortune, perhaps even at Trump's expense.
So to follow up on that, there are reports, as you know, that the president recently lashed out at Parscale over a drop in poll numbers, even threatening to sue him. What does that suggest to you, Robert?
Well, the threatening to sue, I think, was in jest, but it was true that Trump was really, really angry when he was presented with poll numbers that were pretty grim, presented them by Parscale and by Jared Kushner. And these numbers indicated that in all the battleground states and all the swing states, Trump was behind Biden, and that Biden, in fact, was competitive in states like Georgia, which the Trump campaign had figured otherwise to have had in the bag. Trump's tendency often is to blame people other than himself, and so he lashed out at this campaign manager, essentially saying to him, look, I'm not allowed to go to rallies and command, my loyal following. I have to kind of turn the campaign reins over to you while I manage this coronavirus situation. And meanwhile, you're doing a lousy job. My numbers are sagging. So he called Parscale a few uncharitable things. Parscale then said sarcastically, "I love you too." And later they talked that evening and more or less patched things up. But things are not going to get better anytime soon, I don't think. I mean, they're uh, not until the campaign is in full force and Parscale's operation is able to unleash, tens of millions of dollars in negative campaign ads against Joe Biden. For now, right now, the scales have very much tipped in favor of the Democrat.
Finally, Robert, earlier you mentioned a lack of adherence to the facts. So the Trump campaign has a new ad out, and it's drawing a lot of heat from CNN, which sent the campaign a cease and desist letter calling it misleading. Tell us a little bit about this. How has Brad Parscale been responding, and how does his response comport with what it is you've come to expect based on your conversations with him?
Well, so as we established before, for Parscale, it is about the story. It is about the dance. People buy the story, not the substance. And now the new story is the great American comeback. The thesis being that Trump built this economy once, he will rebuild it. And what the ad does is show clips of people speaking favorably of President Trump. And one of them is a clip of Dr. Sanjay Gupta of CNN, the medical expert, who seems to be suggesting that Trump's management of the travel ban of people coming to and from China in late January maybe saved millions of lives, when in fact that is not what Gupta was saying at all. He was talking about stay-at-home orders and how that plus social distancing has saved lives. So CNN has basically issued a cease and desist letter to the Trump campaign saying you can't use that clip anymore. It's utterly misleading. Parscale has lashed back out saying that essentially the CNN has proved yet again that they're really just for the Democrats, that they allow bogus Democratic ads to run all the time. And he said, drop the news cover and just admit it. You're a super PAC for Biden.
All right, Robert Draper for us. Robert, really fascinating piece about Brad Parscale. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Sure thing. My pleasure.